And welcome back to the virtual Lubar Center for another On the Issues program with results of the Marquette Law School Poll. I'm Alan Borsuk, a senior fellow here at Marquette Law School. But more important, we are joined by Professor Charles Franklin, the director of the Marquette Law School Poll. We have been releasing these nationwide results in two stages. One is questions related to the United States Supreme Court. This session deals with questions in general on political matters, things like, how about that Joe Biden guy? And that's where we're going to start. So welcome, Professor Franklin. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the mechanics of this poll, and then we'll get into the results.
Thank you, Alan. Good to be here. So this is a nationwide survey of 1,004 adults. It was conducted March 14th through the 24th and has a margin of error of plus or minus 4 percentage points. We conduct these samples with a random sample of postal addresses around the country. And then we send a piece of mail inviting people to take part in the survey, and they complete the survey online. But it's important to note this is done based on a random sample of the population. This is not a volunteer sample, which you often see in still a few surveys. But the move to what's called address-based sampling allows us to have a random sample of the population, and that's an advantage in doing all surveys.
Since we last did a round of this polling, there's been what we might call a breakthrough issue, which we'll label Ukraine. So let's start there. How are people feeling about specifically how President Biden is handling the Ukraine issue and compared to how they feel about President Biden in general?
Right. So the Russian invasion of Ukraine began before our survey started, though obviously that invasion is still ongoing. 48% say they approve of the way Biden is handling the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but 51% disapprove. So that's close to an even split, but still slightly more disapprove than approve. But by comparison to his overall job approval, that's a little more support for his Ukraine policy. 44% approve of his job overall, 55% disapprove. So a little bit more support for his handling of Ukraine. And all of this was conducted before his European trip this past few days. But it's not like what we saw in earlier decades when an international crisis also often involved a spike in approval of presidents, what we call the rally round of the flag effect in political science. We're not seeing that, and indeed the president's overall job approval has fallen a little bit since January, down from 46% approval in January to 44% now, with disapproval unchanged in that period. So no effect of a rally around the flag, but a bit more support for his Ukraine policy than support for him overall.
Partisan divisions about the Ukraine response by President Biden in the US?
This is a case where you may have to take some of these small numbers in context. On Ukraine, 18% of Republicans approve of the way Biden's handling that. That's an awfully small number. However, only 8% of Republicans approve of Biden's handling of his job overall. So a 10-point bump among Republicans for his handling of Ukraine. Now, that's still an 81% disapproval among Republicans, so I don't want to exaggerate this. But over the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen partisans of the opposite party give almost no credit or response when presidents do things, even things that they might otherwise be expected to like. So in this case, I think it is notable, even if the number is really tiny, that 10% of Republicans are more approving of the Ukraine policy than they are of Biden overall. And obviously, they have a very dim view of Biden overall. With independents, there's also a little bit of a positive uptick, but it's half as much. 41% of independents approve of the Ukraine policy, 37% approve of Biden overall. And then a little bit of a surprise among Democrats, the approval of his Ukraine handling is actually lower than his overall approval. 83% of Democrats approve on Ukraine, but 86% of Democrats approve of Biden overall. So that's I think, an interesting and a little bit of a surprise result. The Democrats are doing the opposite of rallying around a president of their party on this issue of how he's handling the Russian invasion.
Let's turn to the potential for the presidential election in 2024. And it's a little hard to find a huge amount of enthusiasm, I take it, for the candidates.
Yeah, we're doing a couple of things, and we've been doing them in earlier surveys as well, looking at potential matchups between well-known Republican figures and President Biden for hypothetical 2024 elections. I want to emphasize that the purpose of this is not to predict what the outcome of 2024 will be. That is an eternity of time from now in political time. But it's rather to look at the structure of public opinion today and how things are developing within the Republican Party and how feelings about President Biden are manifest today in these hypothetical matchups. We just saw that Biden's job approval is pretty low, and it's down substantially from the summer. We'll come back to that in a little bit. But despite that, Biden has a small lead over 3 Republican challengers that we tested. But even so, Biden barely passes 40% support on these reelection contests, even if he's leading by a little bit. I think the really telling figure is the substantial percentage of people that say they don't like either of the choices and would vote for someone else or not vote. So let's get to the details. We tested former President Donald Trump against President Biden. Trump received 37% of the vote, Biden 41%, a 4-point lead. But 15% said they'd vote for someone else, and another 7% said they wouldn't vote. So this is, I think, an example of a pretty sour mood of the public, that supporters from the base of both of these candidates can be really strong in their support. But there's a sizable, pushing more than 20% of the public that's really unenthused by that matchup. And that will continue as we look at other comparisons. So we also did former Vice President Mike Pence. He receives 33% to Biden's 37%, the same 4-point margin as for Trump, but with more people, 21% saying they'd like someone else, and an 8% wouldn't vote in that case. And finally, Florida Governor Ron Desantis, who is currently often finishing in second place behind Donald Trump in primary presidential primary choices among Republicans. DeSantis gets 33% to Biden's 38%, a 5-point Biden lead. But again, 20% someone else and 9% would not vote. So in terms of our purpose of understanding what's going on in the Republican Party, I think it's interesting that Trump and Pence both trail Biden by 4. DeSantis trails by 5. Hardly any difference among these 3, suggesting that at least for a general electorate, none of these 3 potential Republicans is notably stronger or notably weaker versus Biden. And Biden holds the lead across all 3 of them, though it's a small lead. And with this really substantial of 20% to 30%, who seem very anxious to find some different alternative to the two we've offered.
In terms of general favorable and unfavorable opinions of all four of these people, what's the picture?
Well, the first picture is they're all more unfavorable than favorable. Again, something that used to not be the case of presidential candidates who were almost all viewed net favorably. Joe Biden is the least disliked with a net favorability of -9, 9 points more unfavorable than favorable. Then Ron Desantis at -11, Mike Pence at -22, and Donald Trump the most unfavorable at -25. Biden and Trump are nearly universally known. Pence, despite being vice president for 4 years, finds 16% that say they don't have an opinion about him. And Ron DeSantis, despite getting a lot of attention, especially in Republican circles, has a 39% of the public that say they don't know enough about him to have an opinion. So DeSantis certainly has the most room for this number to change over time as he gets better known. And when we look at these folks within the Republican Party, now looking just at the three Republicans, all of them have pretty solidly positive net favorability, showing the real difference in the way they're perceived within the Republican Party versus among the country as a whole. Donald Trump has a net favorability of 62% among Republicans. Mike Pence, 43%, and Ron DeSantis, 52%. Those are solid, favorable numbers. All of them are less favorably seen when we shift to an important voting bloc, independents who lean to the Republican Party. These are folks that don't quite call themselves Republican, but in terms of voting behavior, most often, usually around 80 to 85% of the time, do vote Republican. But there, Trump drops from 62 to 32, net favorable. Pence drops from 43 with Republicans to 11 with leaning Republicans, independents who lean Republican. And finally, DeSantis drops from 52 to 36. So each of these three candidates is very strong, I would say, among the Republican base, positive, but less so among this important voting bloc of independent leaners to the Republican Party.
But there is a strong support among Republicans for the notion of Trump running again.
There is. And if this is why I think you see him leading the polls that ask Republicans, would you vote for Donald Trump in a primary again? Among Republicans, 68% say they would like to see him run again. But that drops to 54% of independents who lean Republican, about an even split, 54-46. And then among independents, only 29% would like Trump to run again, 71% not. And among Democrats, whether they're leaners or not, 93% do not want Trump to run again. So Republicans still support Trump. They have a very favorable view to him. And 68% of Republicans would like to see him run the campaign again in 2024. But then it's a split decision among leaners and a solid no among independents and, of course, Democrats.
The election that just won't go away, the 2020 presidential election. How are people feeling about confidence in the results of that election outcome?
Yeah, this is a case where we have such a stark split between the general public and the Republican Party in particular. Among the public at large, 63% say they're either very confident or somewhat confident in the outcome of the 2020 election, that the votes were accurately cast and counted. but 37% say they're not too confident or not at all confident. So almost a 2-to-1 split of being confident versus not. But when we look at this confidence within party, we see a dramatic difference between Republicans versus independents and Democrats. Among Republicans, only 24% say they're confident in the election. 76% are not confident. And earlier we looked at leaning Republicans, independents that lean to the Republican Party, but there the doubts about the election are almost as great as among pure Republicans. 29% of leaning Republicans are confident, 71% not. And so here, with these big majorities, whether it's 76 or 71, you can see why election doubts continues to have such a hold on Republican politicians and in Republican primaries that are going on and will be happening across the country this spring and summer, that this doubt about the election remains almost a 3-to-1 majority among Republicans. But then when we move to independents who don't lean to either party, it flips. 67% are confident in the election, just 33% have doubts. And among either leaning Democrats or Democrats, it's 95 or 96% confident. So the gap between opinion about the 2020 election within the Republican Party and that of the public at large and of independents is really quite stark and continues to dominate Republican Party politics for the reason that so many in the party see the 2020 election in very different terms than the public at large does.
Let's turn to the coronavirus pandemic. Since we last did polling on this, the number of cases nationwide has gone down substantially. What are people feeling about how serious an issue it is at this point?
And people feel much more relief about this now, given where the virus is actually taking us at the moment. Just 34% said that COVID was a serious problem in their state now. 66% say it's not a serious problem. For comparison, in January, when Omicron was still near its peak, those numbers were more than reversed. 69% in January said it was a serious problem. 31% said it was not a serious problem. We've seen these numbers of seriousness rise and fall as cases have risen and fallen. In September, when we were in the surge of the Delta virus, 68% said it was a serious problem. Then in November, when Delta was dying out and before Omicron really kicked off, that fell to 50%. In January, with Omicron peaking, 69%. And now with Omicron going away, 34%. You don't want to say it, but I guess I'll say it. Stay tuned. Let's see if we have another round. But it's striking and maybe very, very appropriate that what we see is the rating of how serious the problem is responds very directly to whether cases are surging or are falling off. Maybe the fact that we're down at 34% now with quite low cases, but not negligible cases, does suggest that people are really ready to get past COVID, and they're seeing it as less serious now than in any of the 4 times we've asked about it over the month since September.
I think if you asked, would you like to see COVID go away? It's one of the few questions that would get 100-0 response, but that's another story. Partisan differences still show up in responses to COVID.
They do, and they're pretty stark. Right now, 16% of Republicans say it's a serious problem in their state. 33% of independents do, but half, 51% of Democrats still see it as a serious problem, even as state cases have dropped dramatically in almost all states in the country. So this partisan difference is something that we've seen throughout the crisis. What we've also seen is that when cases go up, Republicans become rated as more serious. So do independents, so do Democrats. When cases go down, Republicans rate it less serious, so do independents, so do Democrats. But the gaps between those partisans still retain their differences. The gaps remain pretty substantial, even in high COVID times and even in low COVID times. So our partisanship is still really strongly affecting how we're reacting to the virus, even after now more than 2 years of the epidemic.
Vaccinations, both overall, what's the answers on that? And again, broken down by partisanship.
Yeah, in our data, we've seen a gradual rise since September in the percent saying they're fully vaccinated. We now show 70% fully vaccinated of people 18 and over, because we only interview adults over 18 or over. But that's risen from 63% that said they were fully vaccinated in September. For comparison, the Centers for Disease Control reports 75% fully vaccinated. So we're maybe a little bit below where the CDC thinks we are on full vaccination. But this poll and have others have tracked the CDC numbers fairly well. But as I say, we're at 70, the CDC is at 75. We do see a party difference here, though, that has also persisted. 63% of Republicans and 64% of independents say they're fully vaccinated, but 86% of Democrats say they are fully vaccinated. If we go back to that comparison about how serious people think COVID is by party, it seems that the Democrats, in seeing a more serious disease, are also more likely to be vaccinated against that. Republicans, who tend to see the epidemic as less serious, a bit less vaccinated. Independents, though, vaccinated at the same rate as Republicans, even though independents tend to see the virus as more serious than Republicans do.
Gasoline prices have also been an issue that's risen in public attention in the last couple months. We particularly were interested in, do you think anything can be done? Do you think anything a president especially can do about gasoline prices? What do we find?
As we've seen in the last, goodness, dare I say 50 years since the oil embargoes that we had in the 1970s, way back then, the price of gas is something that presidents often shudder to be attacked on. Everybody that has to pay the price at the pump is well aware of when prices have gone up. On the other hand, it's fair to say that maybe declining prices don't get quite as much attention as rising prices do. So we asked a question that's been asked across the years. Is the price of gasoline something a president can do a lot about, or is that beyond any president's control? A majority, 51%, say that a president can do a lot about gas prices. Just 34% say it's beyond his control, and about 15% say they don't know whether that's something the president can affect. But there's a big party split on this. 81% of Republicans say the president can do a lot, as do 53% of independents. But only 22% of Democrats think a president can do a lot. And this is a good example of how much our beliefs about things depend on our partisanship and the party of the president. Not only is there a huge Democratic and Republican split now, but when there was a Republican in the White House, those views flipped. Back in 2005, with President Bush in the White House, only 42% of Republicans said that a president could do a lot about gas prices, but 76% of Democrats said they could do a lot about gas prices. Those numbers are virtually flipped today with a Democrat in the White House. And it really is, I think, a helpful reminder that when we think about the way we evaluate presidential activity, presidential policy management, we may think that we have solid beliefs about the economy and economic policy and things like this. But here's a good example of our views of control over gas prices, really very much depending on which partisan we are in the party of the president in the White House. Having said that, even within party, there is a bit of a difference in approval of Biden by how you answer the gas price question. Among Republicans that think a president can control the price of gas, only 2% approve of Joe Biden. But among the admittedly small percentage of number of Republicans who think a president really can't do much, Biden's approval is 33%. Among independents who think the president can do a lot, just 16% approve. But of those who think it's beyond their control, 66% approve. And even among Democrats, those who think the president can do a lot about prices, 77% approve. But those who think it's beyond their control, 92% approve. So the point here is that gas prices can matter, but they're very much in the eye of the beholder. But that said, even within party, thinking the president's in control of prices does lower the president's approval compared to those who think it's beyond their control.
Nationwide, what's been the trend in overall approval of President Biden?
Yeah, returning to this theme of presidential approval, Biden's approval numbers, I think everyone knows, have fallen pretty dramatically since last summer. We had his approval at 58% in July last year. Then that dropped a full 10 percentage points in September to 48, was stable at 49 in November, fell again in January to 46, and now has fallen to 44% in this latest survey. So a pretty substantial decline from July till now. If we look at it within party, again, not surprisingly, the fall has been across the board. But in July, 16% of Republicans approved. That's down to 8% now. With independents, the drop is even more, quite dramatic, from 57 approved to 37 approved with independents. That's a 20-point drop. And even among Democrats, it's down 10 points from 96 last summer to 86 now. So you can certainly see some of the decline in Biden approval is not coming from polarization. The decline is across the board, but it's especially strong among those independents who are an important voting bloc.
Interesting results if you look at this in terms of the racial breakdown.
Yes, and here 40% of white voters or adults approve of Biden's job performance. That's 56% with Black voters and 51% with Hispanics. But again, we see differences in how these have changed over time. Among white people, there's a 10-point drop from 50 to 40 from July till now in March. But among Black people, the fall is a really dramatic drop from 88% to just 56%, a more than 30-point drop. And with Hispanic people, the fall is less, only 5 points from 56 to 51. So not only is the decline in approval across partisan groups, but it's also across racial groups. And among Black people, an especially notable decline that has been steady from 88 to 74 to 68 to 57 to now 56. So that's a solid, steady decline, not a matter of noise in the data, for example. Hispanic approval has been more stable, actually, 56, 54, now 51, down a bit. But I think the trend among Black voters is especially notable, and the 10-point drop among white voters is also important.
You've used the word in some past rounds of grouchy, that voters are kind of grouchy these days. What's the grouchiness index in the big picture here?
Well, yeah, I think the big picture is, if we go back to those hypothetical 2024 matchups, and with between 20 and 30% saying they really didn't want to choose between either of the pair of candidates, I think that's a pretty good measure of grouchiness. The president's job approval numbers in the low 40s now, I think, is more of a function of our strong party polarization. It used to be that we thought of presidential approval as sort of normally in the 50s or low 50s. And we thought when a president got into the 40s, they were in trouble. And when they got into the 30s, they were in big trouble. But in modern times, with over 90% of the opposition party routinely disapproving, that sets a lower ceiling on presidential approval. So I think the approval in the 40s is sort of the new normal, but that doesn't mean it's unimportant. It still means that only 44% of the public approves of the job the president's doing. And even if that is due to party polarization, it still means that presidents don't command the support of the nation the way they once routinely did. Finally, we see the comparison with Ukraine and see that even in handling an international crisis, there's not as much of a rally around the flag effect as we saw in earlier decades. Though, as I pointed out, Republicans are a little bit more willing to credit Biden for his Ukraine policy than they are for his overall performance.
Professor Charles Franklin, director of the Marquette Law School Poll, a great thanks to you for talking with us through getting through these results, and more broadly for all your work on this. We will be back with more results on the national poll in a couple months. And the full results of these rounds of polling, the Supreme Court, and then more broadly on national issues, are available at law.marquette.edu/poll. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back with more poll results as we head towards the November elections. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Alan.